Russian troops are continuing to take territory in eastern Ukraine, but at a heavy cost. Many of the recent gains have been attributed to a battlefield tactic called infiltration. Here's a closer look at what that means.
War on bikes? This tactic is how the Russians are trying to gain ground, according to a video from the Russian news agency TASS. Small groups of soldiers, or even lone fighters, are taking over mile after mile on bikes, or even on foot. First, we cleared the forest near the settlements, says the man in another video from the Russian Ministry of Defense. The commander, he says, guides us with the little bird and tells us who is where and how many. In army jargon, little birds refers to drones used for intelligence gathering or destroying targets. 3.5 years after the start of the war in Ukraine, it is impossible to imagine the conflict without them. Large convoys of heavy tanks, on the other hand, are said to be rare now. This is in contrast to the beginning of the war in February 2022, when images of massive Russian troop movements with heavy military equipment were seen.
At that time, the Ukrainians understood how they had to fight back. With the help of other countries, they began to use drones and invested heavily in them. The Russians also recognized this and developed their own drones. A kind of competition began. Whose drones are better?
Those tank convoys have now shrunk to a maximum of 10 armoured vehicles. Today they are only used as a means of transport. However, they are no longer used in combat. Local attacks are now carried out by small groups of soldiers, usually 2 to 4. Their main advantage is their invisibility. At night, they often wear special coats that mask their body temperature, because the reconnaissance drones are equipped with thermal imaging cameras.
Experts call this tactic infiltration. It is used in several places along the front and is considered successful by the Russians. Propaganda reports from recent months are also supposed to prove this. Several commanders are reporting suspected territorial gains. The infiltration tactic is said to be successful, primarily because, according to experts, the front line is no longer clearly marked.
There is no sharp, clear line. There is no continuous fortification strip. Instead, there are large gaps. Today's front line is a defensive zone, consisting of individual fortifications, individual firing ranges, often in private homes. The most important thing in this zone is not fire control, but visual control.
This means that Ukrainian drones control the front line from the air. Experts say that where this is not guaranteed, the Russians are able to make breakthroughs with their infiltration tactics.
Let's pick up some of these points with Domitilla Sagramoso. She's a military analyst with King's College London. Welcome back to DW, Domitilla. Let's start with the idea of credibility of these claims. Much of this information has come from Russian state media and the Russian Ministry of Defense. How much credence should we give this claim that Russian infiltration tactics using motorbikes are helping its war effort?
To a certain extent, it is true that Russia is relying now on these small infantrymen, groups of infantrymen that are penetrating behind enemy lines, and they help with disruption of supplies among Ukrainian forces. They also provide reconnaissance. So they help to sort of advance very slowly, because as we know now, it's very difficult for the armed forces on both sides to carry out sort of massive sort of armored offensives because of the presence of drones and the visibility that is provided by these, drone systems. So to a certain extent, they help to advance and to sort of achieve small sort of tactical gains, but they're not decisive. And we know that, for example, when we look at what happened a few weeks ago around Domitilla, these advances were very, very slim, and the Ukrainians were able to sort of push them back quite effectively, quite quickly. And so it's even not clear what happened to these sort of advanced forces that had penetrated near Domitilla. So I think that we need to remain cautious. These are the ways in which Russian forces are advancing, and they, as was shown in your program, they sort of exploit gaps within the defensive lines, and they can be disrupted on the backside of the Ukrainian armed forces, but they are not decisive in really creating massive strategic advances.
And we saw there that the dependence on both sides of the little birds, the drones, and we see Russia and Ukraine constantly adapting their tactics in response to rapid technological change. Who do you think, which of the two sides do you think has been more effective at turning that adaptation into an actual battlefield advantage?
I think it depends very much on what time frame you're thinking about. There are moments when the Ukrainians have advanced, then there were moments when the Russians were taking over with fiber optic drones. They were much more effective than the previous ones. I think that now, we can think of it as, a sort of an arms escalation. And there are moments when now it seems the Russians have a bit of the advantage, but I think the Ukrainians have been very, very effective at developing drone systems, which are relatively cheap, and they are providing a lot of intelligence information, and they're making it very hard for the Russians, as I said, to advance with massive amounts of armory. And that really limits the ability of Russia to really carry out a sort of a massive offensive and strike a massive blow and destroy the defensive lines of Ukraine. So I think it is an advancement which is happening on both sides. And I think it's not good to say that one is particularly advantageous vis-a-vis the other side at this moment.
OK, thanks for talking us through that. Military analyst Domitilla Sagramoso from King's College London.
Thank you.